So my latest book is CAIRO, My City, Our Revolution, and as the title suggests, it's a book about the revolution of January 25, 2011. And I really felt, while I was taking part in the events, that the spirit of the place was very important. I mean, obviously the revolution happened all over the country in different cities, but for me it was happening in Cairo, and I'm Cairene, and it seemed that it was of particular value that, for example, at moments our backdrop would be the Egyptian Museum, at other moments it would be the Arab League, at other moments it would be the government Mugamma building, and so on. And so what I tried to do was I tried to give, if you like, an emotional record, a record of how it felt day by day to be part of this enormous, miraculous collective event that was also happening against a particular backdrop, and drawing inspiration from the city, but also making a new history for the city. And that's what I tried to describe. The book is very much a first-person account. Actually, I was in Jaipur when it happened on the 25th of January 2011, and I heard that something was going on, and when I realized what was happening, I left. The festival was just over. I had finished what I had to do on the 25th of January, and I headed to Delhi and then back to Cairo, so that I was there on the 27th and took part in the events of the 28th. So yeah, I was very much part of what was happening. Yes, I mean, the book goes into why it happened, why the country had to revolt, and it also takes on the year since. I mean, basically what it does is it discusses and describes a first-person account of the 18 days, but it breaks them up in the middle, and it goes on to describe what happened over the course of the following year, and then goes back to the 18 days and closes with the fall of Mubarak. Yeah, I mean, it gives an idea of why the revolution had to happen and what it was like being part of it, and then what happened in the year after there was 18 days. Well, everything started from Tunis, really, and we need to remember that it all started in Tunis, and that in a way the fact that in Tunis they were able to make it happen inspired us in Egypt to also push for the removal of the regime. And of course, as everybody knows, it all continues in different forms across the whole region. I don't think so, because I haven't been fully outside. I mean, for 30 years I have lived part in Egypt and part in England, but there hasn't been a year in those 30 that I haven't been in Egypt at least twice, or that I haven't spent at least 6 weeks in Egypt. So I don't think really that I can claim to have any different perspective on what was going on, you know. There are characters, of course, in the book. Interestingly, of course, some of the principal actors are my family, because my family happened to be at the center, if you like. So, for example, my nephew, Ali Abdel Fattah, was known as, he's a computer man, but he was known as a blogger and as an activist. And he had been imprisoned by the Mubarak regime in 2006 for about 2 months. And he was in fact working in South Africa when the revolution happened, and he also dropped everything and came home with his wife. And quite soon he fell foul of the army, and in fact from October was again jailed and given a court-martial for 2 months. So he is very much in there. My sister was one of the founders of the Kifaya movement, which was one of the first movements to work against the Mubarak regime and so on. So they're very, very much players in the book. And then there are other, of course, major opposition figures and major activists and so on. But really, it's the story of a whole people. You know, it's very much a collective story with people sort of coming in and out. Well, the 1 year actually is more or less the fight against the continuing regime, really, because we were very innocent. I don't know that we could have done it differently, but we were very innocent on the 11th of February when Mubarak announced that he was leaving, that he was out. And the army, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, announced that it would safeguard the country and it would protect the revolution and oversee the transition to democracy. And what happened really from then on was the army trying to snuff out the revolution in a series of confrontations that became more and more serious as time went on. The book, as it stands, ends in October. So it ends after the events of Maspero, where a protest of predominantly Christian people was ambushed and there were 27 people killed. And the book ends in October, just after that happened. But in fact, I've had to write an update for the American edition, and that will come out in a few months. And it takes on the following period. But it also can see, because it's with hindsight, it can see the year from the 11th of February 2011 until again mid-February 2012 as a series of confrontations with the army that became worse and worse as we went on. You had Maspero, where 27 people were killed, and then Mohammed Mahmoud, where 42 people were killed and over 3,000 maimed, and then the events of the cabinet office again, and then the football massacre at the beginning of February, where they killed 74 young men. And so it's really, it is a history of the army trying to kill the revolution, and the revolution insisting on remaining alive and fighting back. No, there is no conclusion. I mean, we're in a different stage, because of course what we had elections, and we ended up with a parliament which was then dissolved, and then we've ended up with a president from the Muslim Brotherhood, President Mohammed Morsi, who we believed would be aware of the fact that the votes that brought him in were not the votes of people who approved a Muslim Brotherhood program, but were the votes of people who did not want to see the old regime in the shape of General Shafiq coming to power. And that he had said that he appreciated that, and that as president he would be president for all Egyptians, not president of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, everything that he has done since he has come to power has shown that this was not true. The last thing, of course, being pushing through a constitution which a sizable section of the country did not approve of. So again, we are still in a state really of revolution, because if you look at this, the revolution came in under three main headings: freedom, i.e. human rights, and bread, i.e. the economy, a decent economy, and social justice, which social justice means a reorganization really of the relationships of power within society, with very specific things like free education, free healthcare, you know, with an insurance system and so on. And what we've got is we've got a government that is even more right-wing in its economic ideology than Mubarak's government. In other words, it's completely the opposite of what the revolution wanted. And in terms of like human rights, in the time that since Mr. Morsi came to power, we still have torture in police stations. We still have people being killed in police stations and in jails. We still have people being kidnapped off the streets. We still have court-martialing of civilians. In fact, the numbers proportionally have risen since the days of Mubarak. So, you know, he may have been elected. In other words, the number of votes in the ballot box brought him in. But the procedure, the enactment of government since he has come in has been the same as the Mubarak regime and a little bit worse. Therefore, the revolution has to continue. Yes, the revolution failed to seize power because in a way it was too innocent. We have an odd situation where the best of the revolutionaries look down on the wish to govern, you know. And yet, if you're actually going to have a government that actually works out how to implement the great aims of the revolution, you have to have revolutionaries, you have to have people who believe in those aims. And this is something that we're having to work out. And the other thing is that, of course, you've had, even though the year, I mean, I don't like lumping the 60 years since 1952 together, as some people do, because I think that even though Nasser is the one who started, if you like, the ascendance of the military, his government was very much on the side of the people. In other words, his government privileged the poor. And his government was a patriotic government in that it set up industries, in that, I mean, when he died, Egypt wasn't in debt, for example. But since then, in the days of Sadat and Mubarak, you have this sort of military structure has been used for corruption and has been used to enrich the regime and the elite and so on. But the common factor across the 60 years was that people did not really have a proper political life. Therefore, we are untrained, we are unused to having serious politics, which is why we have failed so far to put forward a credible opposition which can actually take power. And this is something that we're having to learn how to do. I think that for me, what was really, what pleases me and what is, it was a very hard book to write. Because I didn't want to be writing. I wanted to be out on the streets, being part of what was going on. And to take time out to sit and write was difficult. And the other thing was because it was an enormous responsibility, because the revolution belonged to all of us, and I was kind of describing it and kind of speaking on people's behalf. So what makes me happy now when people read it is when people who were involved in the revolution tell me that it brought tears to their eyes, or that when things are very dark now, they go back to the book to remember what it felt like and to remember what it is we want to hold on to. And the other thing is when young people say to me that that their parents go on and on about the city and that they haven't felt it, but that reading my account as an older person of the city and its history and what it was like in the 60s and the 70s, they now feel that that city also belongs to them. And that, of course, is tremendously touching and makes me glad that I did take the time out to write the book. Oh, it goes back because the book is about my city. What I do is we're taking a break and we're sitting on the pavement in Tahrir Square, and so I go on about, for example, how my aunt used to work in that office block and what it was like being 7 years old and going with her to her office and then going out with her into the streets. And so it keeps going back into the Cairo of the past and then coming to where we are now. No, those were personal, historic images of a life lived in a city that I love. Al Jazeera was a very important phenomenon in that it really carried the voice of the man on the street, which Arab news channels had not done before, and also in that it positioned itself as a pan-Arab first and then as an international. And so you really did get a sense of, you know, what's happening in Tunis, what's happening in Morocco, what's happening in Syria, and so on, and the vox populis, as it were. And that was tremendously important. And of course, maybe in that way, it contributed to the revolution. But I think that the revolution has been brewing, certainly in Egypt, it's been brewing since 2000. The first big protests for decades, really, were the protests that went out at the end of 2000 in support of the Palestinian Intifada. And then they kind of didn't quite die down, and then 2003, again, massive marches against the attack on Iraq. And then we had the elections in Egypt, and the Kifaya movement came into being. And really, since 2005, with the elections, the streets were never, ever quiet. From the Arab perspective, the Arab Spring is a kind of Western name, and we're not 100% with it, because sometimes what happens is very ugly, and what happens is difficult. And to kind of prettify it as the spring or the Jasmine Revolution or whatever is not really fair, as it were. Social media was important, but it was important as a tool. So you could, in a time when you had curfew, I mean, remember that in Egypt we were living under the emergency laws since 1981, continuously. In other words, any 5 people meeting together could be arrested, and often were. So in those circumstances, having Facebook enabled communities to spring up around an idea, you know, in virtual space without fear of being arrested and so on. Twitter was also tremendously important, also as a tool in mobilizing, in that you can very quickly you know, tell people what's going on, ask for help, ask for people to bring medical supplies down to a field hospital, and so on. Of course, before social media happened, when protesters organized, for example, flash screenings of videos of torture, they did that using SMSs, they used mobile phone messages. You know, with the Russian Revolution, people used the underground printing press and went around distributing flyers and so on. So social media is just really the contemporary form of that as a medium. And again, it's interesting, as people have noted, that it was when the Egyptian government actually shut down the internet that people went down onto the street, because everything was shut down. You had no way of, you know, working out who was where, what was happening. And so everybody went out, and that was, you know, the 28th of January, and there was no turning back. So everything has a place.